Welcome everyone to the next episode of our Navigator series, this time around services procurement essentials, specifically for the Asia Pacific region. I hope you're all having a wonderful day and are ready to learn more about what benefits a statement of work program could bring to you and your organization. Allow me to introduce you to our speakers from Randstad Sourceright. We have with us Paul Vincent, our Senior Vice President, our now Global Head of Services Procurement. We have Farid Jahanian, who's our Vice President of APAC Managed Service Programs and also our Country Head for Japan, and also Nakeeb Ahmed, who is our Client Services Director and Head of our MSP programs in Australia and New Zealand. Welcome everyone, and then I will give the floor to Paul. All yours.
Thank you very much, Attila, and welcome everybody to this session. We hope that you'll find it both interesting but also enlightening. If you go to the first slide, you'll see what we're going to try and cover in the next sort of 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'd love to have more of an interactive conversation with all of you. So first of all, we're going to be explaining what is services procurement. That expression can mean many things to different people. So what is it? And really simply, what is it not? And then why are organizations actually challenged? Why is it often an area where many different types of enterprises find it difficult to be most efficient and effective? And then we're going to cover this whole area of an SOW management program. What does it include? What are the key parameters of a successful program, and what are the things to watch out for when you're actually creating the design and overall framing of that? And then I'm going to cover off some kind of key ingredients for success based on a broad experience that I've had in this area. As we go through the material, Farid and Nakeeb are going to be helping me to localize some of the particular nuances and approaches that we're going to be talking about. So not only will you get that broad perspective, but we're also going to try and really help you to apply that within the APAC environment. So let's kick off and let's start talking about what is service procurement and why are organizations challenged by it. So very simply, an organization to survive and thrive will buy a whole variety of external services. And these will cover things like IT, HR, finance services, will of course include a whole suite of marketing services. Depending on your organization, you may take a lot of engineering support. Often organizations will spend a lot of money on different types of management consulting. And clearly, if you've got a number of locations, you'll spend money on buildings, facilities, and potentially logistics as well. Now, the key thing about these services is that not only are they very essential for the day-to-day operations of an organization, but they're also, many of them, people-based. And how you contract for those services is around some form of statement of work. Now, if we go to the next slide, the expression services procurement encompasses a whole raft of different activities. Now, if you're familiar with the very famous 7-step procurement process, you'll understand some of these things, but trying to really distill into the critical activities, first and foremost, you have to define what it is you actually want. What should be in the service? What should be the scope of work? Where do you want it to take place? How will you determine whether you're receiving a successful service or not? Secondly, you need to select a service provider to do that work that you feel is best suited for that work. And you need to go through a series of qualifying steps to determine their suitability for that. You clearly have to agree the terms and conditions of the contract, and that will encompass not just commercial terms, but a key element of that is the success criteria. Then, of course, it's all about the delivery and how those suppliers are set up for success within your organization, how you govern that work, and depending on the nature of the actual service themselves, you may have a deep or a shallower level of governance, but that will be specific to the service. And then finally, making sure that you've received what you've contracted for and then you pay for it. Now, clearly, you may be paying for things during the service, depending on the commercial terms, but in the main, you'll pay once you've received that service. Now, of course, because you're applying this sequence of activity to all manner of different types of services, you can't apply them in exactly the same way. So what works for marketing won't always work for logistics, certainly won't work for IT. And so when you're going through the appreciation of how your organization buys services today, you need to look at it through the lens of, well, how does that approach differ for different types of service, and does it differ appropriately? Now let's consider what a statement of work is, and this is an area where often organizations can really get mixed up in terminology. So if we move to the next slide, a statement of work really is a document. It's a document that sets out what's being delivered, what are the terms and conditions of that delivery, and how you're going to judge that what has been delivered meets your satisfaction. Now, there are a number of misconceptions that have emerged over the years, and I'm going to try and demystify and dispel some of these for you. The first is that you often encounter people that will say, I'm buying an SOW. Well, you're not, because it is only that document. You're buying whatever service is covered by that SOW. And SOWs can be 1 page long, and they can be 100 pages long. So that's the important thing to get clear in your mind, that it's not the SOW you're buying, it's what's covered by that SOW. The other misconception is that an SOW is a type of worker. And we're going to cover this in a bit more detail in other areas of this session. When you think of SOW as a worker type, again, you're missing this idea that it's just a way of expressing the work. And so you can apply an SOW to any type of activity that you care to mention. And of course, you can apply it to domestically as well. So in your personal lives, if you have work done on your house, for example, or you go down to a garage and have a car fixed, theoretically, you are working, or they are working for you, to some kind of statement of activity. That third bullet there, again, is very important in that because you're dealing with a whole raft of different services, there will never be a single owner for SOW expenditure within your organization. There'll certainly not be a single procurement owner for that. And so with the variety of different stakeholders, with the variety of different requirements and perceptions of value that they have, then it's no wonder that organizations can struggle to deploy some kind of management layer because they have to try and take account of all those different variations. But there are ways of doing it. And again, we're going to cover this as we get deeper into the session. That fourth bullet point is probably the biggest misconception that I encounter during the course of my work, which is SOWs have to be, they can't be time-based. They have to be fixed price. But that's completely wrong. You can have a time-based SOW. The difference is what triggers payment. Let me give you a really, really simple example to illustrate my point. If you have something going wrong with your electrics at home and you need to bring in an electrician to fix it for you, they will quote you typically a day rate. Now, if they come into your house and they spend a day trying to fix your electrics, at the end of the day, they'll turn around and say, okay, I did my best, but now I'm going to leave. I've done my day, so please will you pay me whatever it is you've agreed. You won't pay them. Why won't you pay them? Because they won't have fixed whatever was your problem. And so they can certainly quote pricing, they can certainly base their fee on time, but you won't pay them unless they've actually delivered what you know they're there to do. And so that's what we mean by a payment trigger. You have to have something that you're receiving satisfactorily before you'll actually pay, even if that commercial structure is based on time. And then that last bullet, which is SAW should only be used with large service providers. Again, any type of business, from a small single person organization to the largest service provider you can imagine, can all be engaged on a service, on a statement of work. So hopefully this really makes it a lot clearer, demystifies some of the often confusion that exists around the service and procurement spectrum, the landscape, and exactly what is a statement of work. So now we go on to the next part of our session and talk about why are organizations challenged by it. Well, one of the key things is that everybody has their own internal perception of the difference between price and value. And what I would think is good value will be different to what many of you will consider good value, will be different to what many of your colleagues consider good value. And it does often depend on the role that people play when they're making those SAW business decisions. So if you're in a procurement role, your involvement in the buying decision will be different than if you've got the actual need and the budget for the service itself. The second bullet point is part of, again, the reason why companies struggle to work efficiently and effectively in this area, because not everything is easy to specify. Now, if you go back to my simple example about my lights going wrong in the house, I don't know what's causing it, but I know I need my lights to be fixed. So if I was to try and write a statement of work for that electrician that said, you come in, you go through those series of checks, you diagnose what's wrong, you then fix it, you then test it, I don't know what they're likely to find when they come in and do it. But if my measure of success is my electric work again when they're finished, then you can get a sense of how you can write and articulate a requirement in a fluid way, in an agile way. And that's often what you need to do. And particularly if you think that when you go to an RFP or a competitive sourcing activity, you try and make sure everything is potentially known up front. That doesn't always play out. So you have to have that fluidity and agility in your approach. Pre-existing relationships and trust are crucial. Well, they're crucial for a couple of reasons. One is that often the projects that are covered by SOWs are really critical. They could be essential to someone's success or failure in their career. So clearly, they want to trust that whoever is going to be doing the work, they can depend on. Now, let me give you, again, an example to try and illustrate that. Imagine you are a customer service director and you're in charge of a team in your organization that manages complaints and responds to complaints. Imagine your complaint performance is going into decline and more people are unhappy with how you're servicing those complaints. You want somebody to come in and diagnose what's going wrong, give you an action plan, and potentially help to implement that action plan. Now, if you've been in charge of that team for 3 or 4 years, that problem, complaint handling performance, has arisen on your watch. You could be held accountable for the challenges and the problems you're experiencing. Therefore, the way you want that company to do the work will be to not disclose too much that it may embarrass you, and to make sure that the solution really helps to secure you in your role. But imagine you took over that team and you've had that team for 2 weeks. You don't have that need to protect the fact that you may have been overseeing the development of that problem. You don't care how many people know. In fact, you want the organization to know how bad it is when you inherited it, because then you can be seen to be the savior of that area. The work that the consulting firm or whoever is the service provider you bring in will be exactly the same. Review, diagnose, come up with an action plan, and help to facilitate it. But the way they approach it will be very different. And that's why trust and relationships are absolutely critical in many of these SOW buying decisions. I've talked about the fact that in this area there are many stakeholders with many different needs and budgets, but you often find that particularly large organizations will use different suppliers for often similar types of project. And because people are very, very focused on what their particular need is, it's not always a natural thing to stop and think, well, have we done this somewhere else in the organization? Who did we use? What did we learn? Could we repurpose any of that work? And then finally, and you'll be familiar with this in the geographic area that you are all from, is that there will be a whole raft of different local and geographical, legal and operating cultural nuances that you need to bake into any particular service management program or initiative. And deeper into the call, Farid and Nakeeb are going to talk about some of those nuances with you. We can now move on to what is SOW manager and really what does good look like. So in terms of the first layer, I'd like to just share some quite startling but very real statistics with you. Now, I talked about how essential services are for an organization to operate, but also it can be key to their competitiveness. And so the better they consume, the better they leverage these services, the faster they could be to market, more agile, the more they can differentiate themselves potentially. But when a CPO audience was asked around how much of their spend did they feel they had control over, that top left stat is startling. That only 30% said they were confident they had control over more than 80% of their spend, which means that a huge, and we're talking a $5 trillion economy worldwide for all of these services, means only 30% of them felt like they had a reasonable degree of control and oversight over the majority of that spend. That's startling. The other one, top right, is equally as startling. Only 27% thought they had a view of clear milestones and deliverables, which meant that all of that money is being spent, and only just over a quarter of that expenditure is being made confidently they know what they're getting at the end of the project. So I won't go through each of those stats, but they all tell its own story. And that story all lines up to one single thing, which is those organizations that manage services effectively and efficiently are much more likely to be commercially and operationally and on a competitive successful than those that don't. So now let's think about what are the key parameters of a program and how you can make sure you set yourself up for success. So if you go to the next slide, please, Attila. So a key thing that we often encounter is that you have what we call disguised contingent workers being engaged on an SOW. Now, how do you know the difference? Well, it is very simple. It's that if you're bringing in individuals, people into your organization to support work, and you're paying them irrespective of the quality, so you are literally just only paying them for their time, then more often than not, they should be engaged as a contingent worker through, if you have an MSP program, through that contingent infrastructure. An authentic SOW engagement, similar to the example I gave you about my electrician, is the work is self-supervised. They're only paid once they've actually achieved something. Now, they may have a number of individual deliverables that may have a price, and so they may be paid during the project, but they're not going to be actually paid any money until they've got past a particular milestone or deliverable. And commercial terms can be any mixture. And you can have within a single statement of work, a fixed price element, a time-based element. You can cap that time-based element. And if you even want to be really sophisticated, you can introduce some kind of incentive, some kind of gain share into that model. So again, it's very important to understand this, that SOW management is not just about identifying potentially misclassified resources. That has to be part of it, but the primary goal of an SOW management program is to support the 5 trillion economy. The amount of money that you spend, which typically is going to be 4 to 6 times more than you spend on contingent workers inside your organization. That's where we want to focus the program. So if we move on, if you are thinking about framing your management program around those things, how do we become more efficient and effective in how we do it end to end? You have to ask yourself a different set of questions. And these are more business-oriented questions rather than what I would call the classic contingent staffing approach, which is we want to put more control in, we just want to get visibility, and it's all about how much money we can save. Because actually, when you're talking about a statement of work service and we're talking about value, it's about how do you maximize that value, not how you drive the price down just to its lowest possible point. Now, no organization in the world is perfect at this. And so the question you need to ask yourselves is, well, where are we on that scale of imperfection? And here are some of the questions that you can reflect on. How much of your organizational spend may not be delivering the return on investment that you expect it to? How many of your suppliers are not delivering to the level of quality or at all delivering what they said they would? How many of your projects and engagements were very loosely defined at the beginning? Now, I have mentioned that it's not always easy to know exactly what you want, but for many, many projects, it is. And so how well is the thinking applied at the outset of a project? What are the success metrics that you are laying down to those service providers? Do you know how much contractual risk you're carrying? Now, many SOWs end up being written on the supplier paper. That carries a risk because actually they can engineer in a lot of terms and conditions which may relinquish their accountability for the outcome. You need to be very careful about that. If you have an in-house procurement function, then genuinely, how much influence and intervention do they have over that end-to-end buying process? And are you bringing real insight into your stakeholders? Are you really helping to facilitate the process? How does your approach today impact your competitiveness? So are you actually doing this quickly and leanly and simply as you can? Or have you got quite bureaucratic processes which nobody is enjoying engaging with? And then finally, depending on what proportion of your workforce is made up of statement of work activity, then how concerned should your executive leadership be? Are you carrying that risk? Now, there are fundamentally two types of program. If you go to the next slide, I would explain what they are. So if you view your SOW-based expenditure, your workforce that is performing these people-based services as a cost or a risk to be minimized, you will inevitably have more of a controlling mentality. But if you view that asset, that workforce, as an asset, then you will want to liberate it, you'll want to enable it, you'll want to optimize it within your organization. Now, in the next slide, you'll see how does a program end up being constructed if it's control-based. You start with the worker. How are we defining the worker? Often the definition is budgetary related. It's not real. It's artificial. And so organizations will bend over backwards to try and differentiate between a contractor and a consultant for definition purposes, for budgetary purposes, but they're going to do exactly the same work. You then apply a whole suite of procurement rules. You try and shrink what people can do. You constrain the sourcing activity. you end up frustrating the supply chain. And then because you're trying to create this really straitjacket process in your organization, you don't have that agility that you need when you think about the reality of how projects change, etc., during their life. Now, a program like this is never sustainably successful. Now, if your organization has significant financial challenges and needs to save money quickly, then of course, control-based solution is needed. But once that particular challenge has been overcome, a control-based program will never sustainably last because it's all about rules. It's not about insight. It's engineered to stop things happening, not to facilitate things happening. So stakeholders, the people with the need and the budget will just circumvent and find ways around it. They'll never feel this is designed for them because frankly, it isn't. It's designed to try and shoehorn things down a particular pathway, irrespective of whether it helps or hinders them in terms of getting the outcomes that they need. And at the very best, it will breed reluctant participation. We don't want to encourage any of you to consider one of these types of solutions. What we want is to have what appears on the next slide, which is you start the thinking with what are you trying to achieve? What's the work you want to get delivered within your organization? And then you then think about all the different ways you could actually get that work done. Different types of service provider, different types of contract structure. You're then prioritizing what is it about that situation that you need to bake into that decision. And then everything else on the process becomes more facilitative, becomes more business orientated, and becomes absolutely something that all stakeholder groups will see value in. Because it's insight led, it's not rules based. It's going to be underpinned by technology that actually drives a smooth workflow. It means that you're going to be eradicating those bureaucratic steps that don't adding any value. So it's very simple. It's as lean as absolutely possible. And you'll be incentivizing participation, and people will see value in this, suppliers included. Therefore, you'll have a much easier path to adoption. And these are the programs which are going to be sustainable long term. We go on to the next slide, please, Attila. So now what I'd like to do is bring Farid and Nakeeb into the conversation because clearly a lot of things I've talked about so far are very much what does this look like overall, and there's a lot of consideration that need to be interpreted and applied locally. So Farid and Nakeeb. So Nakeeb, how would you describe some of the key components of the marketplace in the APAC region?
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. First, want to kind of thank all of you for taking the time of your busy day and joining us here today. So what I'll do is, Paul has covered some really, really good points. So I'll break down the SOW landscape into the two parts, like where the market is today and where the organizational maturity sits in APAC. That's in my experience. So SOW is often a very gray area. This simple 3 letters is unfortunately associated with a very complex nest or maze, which it is not. Right. So I want to take this opportunity to share a little bit of my experience talking to various organizations within the APAC region. So what I see is the acceptance of services procurement, or SOW, is quite different in comparison, and it's probably due to the understanding of what SOW is, and more importantly, what it can do. So when I start the discussion about SOW, more often than not, I get asked, what kind of cost saving will it bring? Now, while cost saving is an element of SOW solution, but it's not the only element, and Paul have covered as well. Like there's all different sectors that it does cover, aside from just the cost. Right? And what I'm also seeing is the use of SOW to engage with off-panel suppliers for contingent workforce. So, which again is not a true SOW, it's purely a workaround for bringing in new suppliers for immediate need. And that leads to misclassification of worker type. And longer this disguised SOW is used in this fashion, the deeper hole we kind of create for ourselves in non-compliance. And depending on the size and complexity, it requires an immense amount of effort to kind of clean up in the future, which I'm sure you'll all agree that it's not cost effective at all. And I've been involved in a few of these cleanup activities myself, and trust me, it's not fun for anyone. And when I ask this $1 million question, and I'm using this $1 million question for a reason, is how much is your SOW spent, or how many suppliers do you have? The answer I get is, Nakeeb, I'm not entirely sure. And this is because the process is not managed by one entity, but rather that every business units are managing their own engagement. It's very, very fragmented. So, and large organizations also have the procurement function divided by sectors, which also poses a challenge in bringing data and key people together. So before even we get into the discussion of how SOW can benefit, as a first step, if you simply look at your spend, the number of suppliers from a centralized dashboard, you'll almost immediately start to see opportunities for optimization, consolidation, or risk management, spend management, correct the classification, and the list kind of goes on. And they also are tied to local legislative nuances. What's the definition of each of those categories? Does it fit in the right space, or does it cover the right length? And then how do we define the output? Right, so I want to kind of touch also on the contractual piece. So what I mean by that is understanding what the organizations are buying. It is common, and again, Paul did touch on that before, it's very common for large outsourcing companies to kind of influence buyer's decision. And the way the contract is designed is not always necessarily fulfilling what the buyer needs. And I've seen this as well many times in APAC. And moving into the maturity side in APAC, in all honesty, not many MSPs in APAC have SOW solutions embedded in the program. And the ones that do, it's not always the full end-to-end management. So the maturity level is not quite where we would like that to be, but that's not always a bad thing. It just means that we need to start having those conversations in a more constructive manner. And we are seeing that. We're seeing organizations coming up and having that discussions started or showing that curiosity. However, though, we're still experiencing that sense of hesitance or reluctance. And there's always something that gets priority over SOW solution, like whether it be improving contingent worker onboarding lifecycle, or let's start looking into this after we finish certain project, and so on and so forth. So in APAC, end-to-end SOW management is not seen as a priority, and all the focus kind of goes into the contingent labor engagement in MSP. And then there is this lack of visibility on data, which again comes down to it's not having a centralized tool or a centralized team who kind of facilitates that SOW management. And it often leads to ambiguity in procurement objectives, and it also kind of creates that perception that, hey, it's too hard or it's too impossible to bring everyone together. But if we kind of have the right people with the right experience and the technology behind it, we can easily simplify this process. And it's important that we find the right partner who can collaborate in building that roadmap. But this is pretty much my experience and observation. But if I can ask you, though, Farid, given that you have heavily invested time in APAC region, do you kind of agree with my observation here, or do you think I'm completely off track? Hope I'm not.
I'll safely say, Nakeeb, you're not off track. I think it's really great for us to be having this conversation and really sort of putting these ideas out there in terms of how do we start these conversations? Because what you intimated, and as Paul talked about at the start, every part of the business has different ways of working with this sector. Services procurement, or SOW, is such a broad topic, whether you're looking at managed capacity or elsewhere. And often in the APAC region, it's you usually have a small procurement team looking after broad geographies, broad markets, or broad sectors. And trying to bring all of that together in one go is very, very difficult. So the conversations we're having right now, whether it's in Japan, China, India, Australia, wherever it is, or in Singapore, often it's led by somebody who's trying to find a cost benefit. And as you intimated at the start, is how do we start that first level of conversation to show there's some value here? And often when you do a cost, because it's always theoretical, we're always going, well, give us the data, we can tell you in exact terms. It sort of puts the cart before the horse, if I use a very English phrase for that. So what we generally try and do is bring some visibility. So when we have MSP programs, is really look at which segments, which areas can we go into to pilot or provide visibility and show value in outcomes. As Paul mentioned, it's about how do you make sure you've got the right problem defined before you go out to market, and how can we help businesses do that and use the technology around it? Because in our region, it's complex, and we've got long-standing relationships in different markets where there is legislative and regulations in place that mean SOW isn't always as clearly defined as Paul intimated at the start. Sometimes you do need SOW to help provide flexibility in the workforce, which is different from services procurement. And all of these sort of things come together to mean when you go out to the business, the concepts are confused. When we're trying to make that business transformation, it's very hard for us to do that. So really, as Paul said, it's about how we define and how we move forward. So everything you said, I completely agree with. And when you look at as well, one of the subjects that Paul talked about, which is independent contractors, that's a topic that is definitely moving very, very quickly. And this is also how do you deal with those micro enterprises, and how do you deal with things around contract of services or for services in Singapore, for example, and how we sort of drive those things forward. So what you've said is 100% the experience I'm having and the conversations I'm having with our clients.
Thanks very much for Farid and Nakeeb. Really useful to then sort of look down the lens at how some of the things I've talked about so far play out in your region. Now, you both mentioned around integrating this type of service within an MSP program. So let's look at some of the global stats for what happens if you do that. So Attila, if you go to this slide here, this should make your eyes open. And because Ardent Partners do an annual survey, some of you may participate in that. It's a global survey of many hundreds of buying organizations who are buying people-based services and buying contingent workforce solutions. And what they found when they looked at the best-in-class organizations is that nearly 90% of them, 90%, are more likely to have access to really forward-thinking, innovative analytics than those that don't. They're going to achieve, by magnitude, 3 to 5 times more savings than those organizations that do not integrate SAW management in their MSP program. And more than 90% are like to have much more mitigating activity around compliance and risk controls. And just quickly bringing back in Farid and Nakeeb, I mean, these are global numbers, of course, but from your experience, it's a game changer to be able to bring the two sides of the equation together. Would you agree?
Completely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's again, how is the business making decisions, and how do we do that? And that data is that. I completely agree with everything you just said there.
Good. Okay. So now let's step on to why do it. We've talked about don't just think about cost, think about value. We've talked about thinking about the work up front. So what are those key standout benefits of managing your SOW activity more efficiently, more effectively? So absolutely, you need to make sure you're using the right resources for the right work. You need to make sure that every statement of work you're writing is properly focused on the outputs you require, not just the inputs that you get from a service provider. You want to make sure you're writing high quality SOWs every single time, and you're getting the learning inside your approach as you put more education, get more insights into your end-to-end process flow. From a budget holder perspective, whoever has got the need for that SOW, you want them to be getting the absolute best return on investment for them. Back to this point around everyone perceives value and price differently. So what is the right blend of value for them? That's what they get on a sustainable basis. It means that the suppliers you're using, whether they're preferred or they're situational, are always going to be offering the right level of choice for your organization. And that validated choice is really, really important. And how are you validating those suppliers are suitable to work with your organizations? You'll have minimized contractual exposure. Where appropriate, you'll be engaging on your terms and conditions, not on the supplier's terms and conditions. At the very least, you'll be making sure that all of the key requirements that you have flow through into that contractual documentation. Once the work starts, then you'll have complete visibility of who's working on an SOW-related project. When did it start? What are the key milestones? How's the project going to be governed? How are you going to be assessing success? And there is a structured way of monitoring this end to end. You're going to have a professional, efficient, effective way of governing change. Projects do change. Of course they do. Priorities change. Scope changes. How do you actually engineer that change into a way of not having to go back to the start, not having to put in place great bureaucratic hurdles, but equally, how do you make sure that you're properly gating that change? So those suppliers who can do this, they will quote very low prices at the beginning to win the work, because they know they can then make their money on change control, because largely that's loosely governed. You eradicate some of that behavior. And then finally, you will be able to hold the suppliers to account for what they're doing, because you're properly qualifying and articulating that. End to end, you'll have a set of management information that enables you to inform your decision making, and you'll always know where things are in the cycle. Now, these four things, these four areas represent what we call the SOW engagement lifecycle. And often organizations really focus on the transaction piece, and it's the sourcing piece that is representing that yellow box. The red box is all about definition, how you're defining what you want. The muddy green box is around doing the actual work, and the blue box is around evaluation. The most successful programs look across that line of sight from define, source, do, and evaluate. And we're going to offer you the chance to come to a follow-up session where we go into that in a lot more detail. What I'd like to do in the last 5 minutes before we come out to Q&A is just give you some experiences, some thoughts, some tips from me about what are the key things that I've always encountered that organizations are challenged by and what they need to bear in mind. So the first one, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed. As Nakeeb said, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. You don't know where you currently are in terms of data, spend, activity. And because you don't know where you are, you think you can't actually do anything because you need that in order to get started. But don't be overwhelmed by the data. Think of it in terms of your problem statement. What are the problem statements you're trying to address? And then where you have data, then try and apply that to those problem statements. But remember what I said, nobody's perfect. No one has all the information they need before they start. So don't think that you need to. Tip number 2, be realistic. Right? It really doesn't matter where you're starting from. It's all about where you want to get to. And organizations have all levels of maturity, but you'll also have different levels of maturity for different types of spend. What you do in IT may be different to marketing, will be different to consulting. So you can expect that. And how you manage this spend will be a reflection on how mature and integrated is your procurement function. What are the budgetary policies within your organization, and how does that work? So there are lots of variables and indicators that will all equal well, we're not very good in our starting point. So be realistic and don't be worried. The more transparent you are, the more likely you are to have a program that's successful. Tip number 3 is don't think about this as extending the contingent staffing infrastructure into services-based spend. Don't think of the answer being control. Please don't think of the answer being just stopping perceived maverick and rogue behavior. Think about this as a specialist subject in its own right. You need to think about how do we enable the business to get their work outcomes done in the way that they need it. So tip number 4 is focus on the real customers. And yes, procurement, HR, functional leadership are very important stakeholders. But the real customer for a solution are the people with the need and the budget. And if you look at some of the market analyst research, by far, the number one reason programs fail is because of lack of adoption. And it's no wonder, because the programs are not designed for them. They're often designed to put some kind of circuit breaker into the system when all the business needs is for that current to keep working. Tip number 5 is don't try and do too much too soon, but don't have too small a vision. What you often encounter is people will say, well, we'll just start with worker tracking. Minimally disruptive, and we can get a foothold in this area. And all that happens is the extent of your solution is designed around worker tracking. But think about it in terms of, well, if we want to make sure that we are moving towards a best practice approach end to end, what are the stepping stones we need to go on to get there? So your vision is, how do you have a really, really effective end-to-end process? And then you break it down into steps. And step 1 may well be worker tracking, but it's not the end game. And that's a really important thing. If I was to think about all these different tips, that's one key thing that I would ask you to remember. Tip number 6 is don't reinvent the wheel. Yeah. There is enough knowledge about best practice procurement. You don't need to come up with a brand new procurement process. You need to identify what are those key steps in that end-to-end workflow, determine how you're doing against those today, and then try and work up a plan to improve. But you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Trust me, it's already been invented. Number 7 is to choose the right benchmarks. It's very hard to compare yourself against yourself. And you need to bear in mind, if you just look at things like, the average price you're paying, so day rates, if you look at cycle times, make sure you've got the relativity in place, change control. Try and identify the different scenarios, situations in which those buying decisions have taken place, and use that knowledge to set your benchmarks. Try and avoid these arbitrary numbers, because actually they won't tell you the situational necessity you need for real insight. And then the final one is don't go it alone. Yes, there are lots of reasons why an in-house approach can be effective, but bring in external perspective. If you have an existing MSP provider, use them, leverage them. How can they help you with the benchmarks? How can they help you to work through your thinking? Make sure the solution is fit for purpose, but try and make sure you're really optimizing all the expertise that you have out there. So some simple tips for you. Attila, Farid, back to you. See if we have any questions.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nakeeb, Farid, and Paul. So yeah, if you have any further questions, feel free to, by the way, send it directly to me in the chat function to the Randstad Sourceright host, or you can put it also in the public chat as well. And yeah, I'm going to start off with the first one. Paul, how can you tell how mature an organization is at services procurement today?
That's a good question. It's and it's very much, it depends answer. I mean, I've talked about being honest about where you're starting from. We've actually tried to create a maturity diagnostic. I talked about having those 4 stages of the life cycle, and what we try to do is come up with some key questions that help you determine where are you starting from in each of those different areas. And one of the things they're thinking that we know that we're engineering to our maturity diagnostic is the lens of procurement, the lens of HR, the lens of finance, the lens of the business stakeholders will all be slightly different. So how you determine your maturity is you have to see it as a sum of that view, not just one particular lens on the process. And certainly, just kind of flagging, for our follow-up session, we'll go much more into the detail of how we can help organizations with that.
Thank you. And the next one is, how do suppliers benefit in an SOW management program? Because we talked a lot about how companies benefit, but how do suppliers benefit from that?
Well, I'll give 2 or 3 headlines, and I'll obviously let Farid and Nakeeb come in from a more localized perspective. In the main, it's creating a platform for future work. Most service providers are only as good as their last engagement. That's the currency that they have, whether it's in your organization or how they can leverage the work they're doing for you as a case study in others. There's also a big cost of sale associated with proposing, pitching, developing. And so if the program does those 2 things, which is minimize cost of sale, so that commercial benefit can come into the pricing structure, and it gives them a platform for future work, either within your organization or to leverage that to showcase what they can do outside, then they will absolutely be falling over themselves to come in to the program. Farid, Nakeeb, anything you wanted to add to that?
I think, Paul, you've kind of nailed it. But if I'm to add, you've mentioned before in the presentation, how big this industry is, and this SOW management program, it kind of creates a clear objective for all parties, not just for the buyer, it's also for the supplier, and it's that opportunity to expand their service through a proper KPI management, or centrally managed means more opportunity for like the MSP owner to tag the right supplier for any upcoming project. So if an MSP provider has multiple clients, it also means that we can create that platform where high-performing suppliers, supplying partners, can have opportunities in multiple different buyers. So it kind of creates that platform for them. And given how big this industry is and how big the spend is, there's so much opportunity for the suppliers, and they can kind of use this platform to get into that. So there's a massive commercial benefit.
Yeah, I think
absolutely.
Paul and 100% completely agree with what you said, but I'll try and take a slightly controversial position on this and say, just think about how much time is wasted with suppliers that aren't performing, that you don't know are performing, and you're dealing with escalations, you're dealing with all these different things. A lot of the time we do want to get the performance of the suppliers working. So while we're engaging, we also want to make good decisions around which suppliers are being used where and when. So adding to those points, we want to rationalize and we want to have the best for your organization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm picking up on your point, Farid. I mean, them knowing where the bar is for success is critically important. How are they comparing with other similar suppliers in their industry? That's gold dust, from a competitive standpoint. And so that, again, has real value to bring to the program. Attila, any other questions?
Sure. So our next question would be, is that how do you increase the level of adoption in a program?
Adoption is the holy grail, without a doubt. And one of the key things that I always advise customers is don't put hurdles in front of adoption in the beginning. So whilst it will be tempting to say, look, we've got all of these new processes and we want to be fully baked from the beginning. If your organization is used to doing things in a very different way, be sensitive to that. So try and encourage them into the program by minimizing the change they will experience, but maximizing the visibility and the insight that you will have and you can give them. So often it's the first 6, 9, 12 months. Focus on how do you encourage people in, because it helps them to do what they're already doing quicker, easier, smarter. That way, you're not going to get that resistance. I remember a couple of years ago, I was in Australia actually, and I was working with a particular client who had a problem with some suppliers in the program, some suppliers out of the program. And they asked me, how can we incentivize? How can we make sure we get everybody in? And I said, well, this may be counterintuitive, but why don't you allow the suppliers to charge more for being inside the program rather than not? And it's just thinking laterally about how you eradicate some of those internal barriers will accelerate the success of a program. But it does go back to some of the things that Farid and Nakeeb talked about as well, in terms of the kind of the nuance, the local perspective. But absolutely, clear out all the barriers as much as possible.
Our next question from the audience is actually pretty similar as that. How do you sell the benefits of an SOW management program internally?
Well, I mean, I gave you the list of benefits, you know, on the slide a little while ago. But the key thing is, if you're a person with a need and a budget, what do you want? You want the quickest possible route to getting your service provider to start work. So the more you can focus on speed, simplicity, enablement. Often stakeholders don't want to be involved in the administrative process, but they have to, because they feel that if they don't, that they're not going to get what they want. And so you really need to look through the lens of what they need and orchestrate the story around that. Just conscious of time, Attila, we probably need to wrap up with the final information for people.
Absolutely. So yeah, by the way, if you have any questions later on, you will be able to reach us, of course, afterwards as well. And of course, we have a little bit of a surprise for you all, that we have an exclusive and of course free workshop for you all in the second half of July, where you will be able to discuss in a panel format, all of you just sitting together with Paul and of course with local experts as well, what and how your organization specifically, so you can come of course with your own specific problems, issues, questions, challenges, etc., to discuss how it would benefit your organization. And you can register by either scanning this QR code, which you can see right now on the screen. And of course, we will send the link to you all in a follow-up email as well. So we will welcome you. Just please register, and we will reach out to you with the further details very soon of how you can, of course, be in which format to have this workshop with Paul and of our local experts, whether it's Nakeeb or Farid, we will decide this later. So second half of July, scan the QR code now, and then you will be able to go directly to the form. But of course, we will send you in our follow-up email with the recording also a way to register to this workshop. So I think actually that will be it for today, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and spending your afternoon, evening, or morning with us, wherever from the world you're joining us. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, Farid, Nakeeb, and of course, Paul, for sharing all these very valuable insights, I believe. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.